Hi everyone, this video is strictly if you missed Tuesday's class or Wednesday's class, whether it was for SAT or perhaps you were just absent. It's the last new material before the unit test, so I figured I'd just do a quick short overview of what we discussed in class. So I'll get down to it. All right, so I want to do the do now question with you really quickly because I think it's a good way of tying everything that we've done up until this point together. It's asking what is the difference between descriptive, experimental, and correlational studies. The two that are most together, I think, are descriptive and correlational. And the reason is this. Both of those don't have variables that you manipulate, okay? Descriptive is when you go out into the field with naturalistic observation. You're writing down what you see. It's not that you're actually, causing something to change in order to see people's reactions. Okay, that would be experimental. Correlational, likewise, you're not manipulating variables. You're taking that basic research data, maybe what you've collected in descriptive, and then seeing two variables that aren't independent and dependent, they're just variables, and seeing how much they line up. How much do they coincide? Like the one example that we were talking about with margarine consumption and divorce rates in Maine. Okay, it's not that you're actually manipulating the amount of margarine people are consuming and then seeing what happens to their marriage rates. Instead, you are looking at these two things and comparing them. Do they rise together? Do they fall together? If you wanted to prove correlation is actually causation, you would then need to do an experiment. And experiments are any time you are manipulating variables to find that cause and effect relationship. So, you need an actual variable that you're changing around and then seeing what happens as a result. And that's experimental. And I think that just kind of ties everything up nicely and that you might have a better understanding of the differences between those different types of studies. Now that we finished that, on to the new material, which is ethics. Okay. Ethics and experimentation. This is basically asking, how do we fairly treat our test subjects? Okay, animals are the easy thing to look at because I think we're all pretty horrified when we mistreat animals. We like in psychology to use animals quite frequently in our experiments. What's true for animals tends to be true for humans, and it's a much simpler experiment to run than necessarily getting a human involved. Okay, the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, they've put out some guidelines about how you should treat animals. And there's really two main things. There should be humane care and healthful conditions. So again, you want to be taking care of these animals and not mistreating them. You also want to minimize discomfort, which again, you don't want actual abuse. And there's certainly examples throughout psychology where this hasn't necessarily been the case. Pavlov is a perfect example of that. His dogs that he used in his conditioning weren't actually treated so well. Like he had like stomach tubes inserted into them to see about digestion of food at one point. It wasn't exactly how you want a dog to be treated. So again, there are certainly examples of this being abused. Unfortunately, there are a lot of examples of human beings also abused. There are four main things that you need to look at in order for your experimentation to be considered humane. So first is informed consent. Oops, sorry, as the lights turn off here. Informed consent is getting the agreement of your participants for them to agree. You have to explain to them all about what the experiment is. What is it testing? Do you have to give them details about, say, what experimental group or control group if they're going to be in it? No, but you need to inform them that there will be an experimental group and a control group. Where they fall, that they just shouldn't know, actually, because it might influence the results of the study. But you need to make sure that they're aware of all the risks that could potentially be a problem for them if they contribute to this study. Next is to protect participants from greater than usual harm and discomfort. You straight out can't abuse people. 3, you're going to keep individual information about participants confidential. So kind of like with the teacher, I can't run around talking to other people about your specific grades with your name attached to them. I never do that. I can only do that for you. specifically and for your parents. Other than that, I'm not telling anybody about your grades. Okay. And the reason is that's not fair. It's an ethical concern if you're sharing information specifically. Can I talk about grades in general and talk about averages of, oh, this class did better or worse? That's perfectly acceptable, but I can't name names. And it's the same thing with experimentation. If you have a reaction to something, your name should not be associated with that. The last one is about fully debriefing people afterwards. You finished your experiment, you should tell them what were the results. What have we now learned? How has knowledge been improved because of the experiment that they participated in? Okay. Who decides all this? That would be the institutional review boards, or IRBs, which you will frequently see on AP exam questions. They are boards that tend to establish themselves in colleges and they test these guidelines. So you basically would propose an experiment, kind of like the experiments that you guys already proposed. And they would go through and look at, have you considered all these ethical concerns, those 4 steps? And if you haven't, then they're going to tell you to go back and change your experiment so that it meets these standards. Okay. Most frequently, how I see this quizzed on the AP exam is either in an FRQ or multiple choice, where it'll give you a scenario and then ask you, all right, which of these ethical considerations were either ignored or abused in the experiment that we just described? Or would the institutional review board actually push forward this exam, like this experiment, and say that it was good? Okay. So that is a kind of overview of what the ethical considerations are. The next 2 things are short videos that I'll post with this video that I made because I don't have enough time on this recording device to show you the video through, but I'll talk to you really briefly about. The first one is 5 unethical experiments in psychology. Most of these you'll see again. The first one is talking about little Albert, okay? Then it goes to the monster study, which both of those are dealing with children and instances where they were horrible to kids, basically. And then it talks about the Milgram experiment, which is abuse of power in adults. You see the Milgram. I know the last one they talk about is the Stanford experiment, which is basically with prisoners. They had a group of people who were prisoners, and then they were people who were in charge of them, and it ended up that they started beating the crap out of the individuals, and some of them were actually harmed for the rest of their lives, which is problematic. And then there's another one that tested the bystander effect, where basically people could have considered that they were dying or watching somebody die, and that you just can't do, because if you think you killed a person or that you've harmed them, even if it's not true, that can have really lasting negative effects on people. So all of those experiments in the video that it goes through, we'll talk about why they're unethical, and just, again, go through what they would have needed to do in order to, kind of get approval. None of those experiments would have been able to be run today with our current set of standards. All right, last experiment that I will post the video for. This is something called the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Okay, I think you guys know what syphilis is. It is a sexually transmitted disease. It is one that, if left untreated, will kill you. Okay, and basically in 1932, all the way, and this is the most horrifying part of this, or actually one of many horrifying things about this study. From 1932 to 1972, the American government established a study in Tuskegee, Alabama, where they took poor African American males who were tested positive for syphilis, did not tell them that they had syphilis, and basically were recording the results of what happens to somebody, to their brain, to their behavior, as they go through all the different stages before it actually kills you. This experiment lasted for 40 years. They were never told that they were testing positive for syphilis. Um, More horrifying even is that like by the 1940s, we knew that penicillin without a doubt could cure syphilis. So these people died unnecessarily. We could have saved them. They did not treat them with what we knew would solve the problems. It wasn't until 1972 that it ended. And basically, the reason they ended it was because one of the participants, went to a civil rights lawyer and they were able to put a stop to it. The United States government did not apologize until I think it was 1997. It was late 90s, though. Um, it's just kind of horrifying, the whole thing. And I had a little note on here too that not to confuse this with the Tuskegee Airmen. You might have learned about that in 11th grade, or if you're in 11th grade, you could potentially be learning about that soon. It's a World War II era thing. The most frequent thing I see is that people confuse them and they think that the airmen who were actually a huge step for the diversifying of our military during World War II, and a very good thing. They think they're the ones that are experimented on, and they're not. It's just Tuskegee, Alabama, is like the common factor here. So just be aware of that, and that's why that note is there, just so that you don't confuse those two things. One's a horrifying experiment, the other is actually a positive thing. So that was kind of how I wrapped up the information. I'll put the video on there so that you can also take a look and see what you think of that. It probably hits every single reason in that list of 4 ethical behaviors. It caused harm. They did not have informed consent. In fact, they didn't even tell them they had syphilis. They did not debrief information and share information. Um, you know, it's like every step of the way they just blatantly did not ethically meet any standards whatsoever. All right, so hopefully you found this helpful. I again will post those 2 short videos, one's 10 minutes long, and if you just kind of skim through it, it'll be a good example of how ethics violations have occurred. And the last one, if you have interest in the Tuskegee experiment, you can see the greater influence of what this did to that population, and honestly, the distrust and discrediting of medical professionals in the African American community. So if you have questions, reach out to me and I'll hopefully see you soon.